Today we're going to discuss the very important and long-lasting legacy of the late 17th and 18th century movement known as the Enlightenment. But before we start, I want you to pause this video for a second and go grab your notebook if you haven't already. I'd really like you to take notes on this lecture and to write down any questions you have for me in class tomorrow. Now, if everyone is ready, let's begin. Enlightenment philosophy really took its clues from the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century. People took the ideas of this new science of the early modern era and were now going to apply them to their study of human society and government in the late 17th and 18th centuries. Thus, the Enlightenment was born. Enlightenment philosophy Enlightenment thinkers really emphasized reason over revelation and had a strong belief in progress. Over a few short decades, Enlightenment thinkers had challenged long-held ideas about society and government. They undermined such principles as divine right of kings and the traditional social hierarchy that had divided people along class lines for centuries. All of these new ideas really had a profound impact on the history of Europe and really indeed the world. What makes the impact of the Enlightenment so significant is not only how transformative the changes were, things just changed so dramatically, but also how long-lasting. As an intellectual movement, the Enlightenment really, in my opinion, ranks as one of the most important you will study this year, as it's a movement that completely transforms our views on human nature, establishes new criteria on what makes a government legit, and leads to other equally important turning points like the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. It also leads to the South American and Mexican wars of independence in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Enlightenment also sparks a desire for progress and reform that is going to manifest itself in the form of the women's suffrage movement and the movement to abolish slavery in the 19th century. Well, now that you kind of have a general idea of the overall impact of the Enlightenment, I'd like to take a look at each one of these impacts more in depth. First, the Enlightenment and its belief in progress is really going to produce a spirit of reform in Western Europe. The new enlightened ideas of equality and the belief of the dignity of all individuals results in several reform movements, especially in the late 18th and 19th centuries. These reformers would actively seek to relieve human suffering and ignorance among children, the urban poor, prisoners, and slaves. The two reform movements we're going to really focus in on during class in this unit are the movement for women's suffrage and the abolitionist movement to end slavery. Now, these movements aren't going to have immediate success, but eventually with persistence and dedication, slavery will be first abolished in Britain and eventually in America in the 19th century. While women's suffrage is going to take longer, eventually women in Britain are going to win the right to vote in the early 20th century. The individuals and groups who fought for decades, some even fighting for over a century, are going to be fueled by these Enlightenment ideas of equality and progress, and they're not simply going to give up until they achieve their goal. Other than the belief in equality and progress, the other big Enlightenment idea that transforms the world is the new ideas on government legitimacy. Enlightenment philosophers like Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau questioned and eventually dismantled traditional beliefs in divine right of kings and absolutism. John Locke defended the displacement or the overthrow of a monarch who could not protect the life, liberty, and property of the English people. Jean-Jacques Rousseau stated that society should be ruled by the general will of the people and expressed through direct democracy. Baron de Montesquieu declared that power should not be concentrated in the hands of any one individual, recommending separation of power in government among an executive, legislative, and judicial branch. These new ideas completely changed our belief on what constitutes a legitimate government and leads to the reform of some absolute monarchies, like in Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and outright revolution in others, like France. From the salons of Paris and the coffee houses of Britain, the Enlightenment spirit also swept through Europe's royal courts. Many philosophers, including Voltaire, believed that the best form of government was a monarchy, not a direct democracy in which the ruler respected the people's rights. The leading philosophers of the day often wrote and sometimes even visited absolute monarchs to try to convince those monarchs to rule justly and enact many of their ideas on government. Some monarchs embraced these new ideas and made reforms that reflected the Enlightenment spirit. They become known as the enlightened despots. A despot, of course, means an absolute ruler, and enlightened refers to the fact that they believe or have enacted some Enlightenment ideas. The enlightened despots supported the philosophers' ideas, but make no mistake, they also had absolutely no intention of giving up any power to the people. Their belief in the ideas of enlightenment only went so far. The changes the enlightened despots made were really motivated by two desires. They wanted to make their country stronger, and they wanted to make their own rule more effective. The three main enlightened despots that emerged in Western Europe during the Age of Enlightenment are Friedrich the Great of Prussia, Joseph II of Austria, and of course, Catherine the Great of Russia. Friedrich II, the King of Prussia, called himself, quote-unquote, the first servant of the state. From the beginning of his reign, he made it clear that his goal was to serve and strengthen Russia. He's going to do this by granting many religious reforms, reducing censorship, and improving education. He also reformed the justice system and abolished the use of torture. However, Friedrich's changes only went so far. For example, he believed that serfdom was wrong, but he did nothing to end it since he needed the support of the wealthy landowners to really maintain his absolute rule and to achieve his other goals. As a result, he never really tried to change the existing social order. Remember that Friedrich the Great's goal isn't reform itself. Rather, he sees reform as kind of the way to get what he really wants, which is a strong and unified Prussia under his absolute control, of course. Now, the most radical and probably the one that's truly enlightened is probably Joseph II of Austria. He is the son and successor to Marie-Therese of Austria, and just thinking about the next unit, he's also the brother of Marie Antoinette. He rules Austria from about 1780 to 1790, so not a long time. He introduced legal reforms and freedom of the press. He also supported freedom of worship, even for Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, which for the time was pretty darn radical. But his most radical reform, Joseph II abolished serfdom and ordered that peasants actually be paid for their labor in cash. Shocking, I know. Not surprisingly, the nobles hated this and really, vehemently resisted it. As a result, like many of Joseph's reforms, it was undone after his death. So all in all, Joseph II is pretty aggressive in his implementation of Enlightenment ideas, but this isn't going to have a long-lasting impact on Austria. Now, the last, and in my opinion, the most interesting of the enlightened despots is Catherine the Great of Russia. She was also the ruler that seemed to be the most admired by the philosophers. She ruled Russia from 1762 to 1796. She's really going to continue Peter the Great's westernization of Russia that we learned about in our previous unit on absolutism. The well-educated empress really read the works of the philosophers, and she even exchanged many letters with Voltaire. At one point, she even let Diderot stay with her, as he had fled France due to the unpopularity of his encyclopedia, with a government who kind of thought it was seditious and subversive, which it kind of was. You know, the whole idea of, people being educated being a threat to the government. In 1767, Catherine forms a commission to review Russia's laws. She presented it with a brilliant proposal for reforms based on the ideas of Montesquieu and Beccaria. Among those other changes, she recommended allowing religious toleration and abolishing torture and capital punishment, clearly being influenced by Voltaire there and Beccaria. However, her commission never actually enacts these radical reforms, as they were horribly unpopular with the nobility, who she needs to stay on her throne, especially after the serfs rise up in revolt, because, equality. Her views about enlightened ideas changed after this massive uprising of serfs in 1773. With great brutality, Catherine's army crushes the revolt, which really spelled the end of her efforts at Enlightenment reform. Clearly, she had kind of learned her lesson that if she kind of proposes these Enlightenment ideas, her people are going to run with it. They don't want just a little bit of freedom. They're going to rise up in revolution, and she's not willing to have any of that. So just remember that some of these enlightened despots are more enlightened or radical than others, and the reforms were often half-hearted, reversed after their deaths, or really just another way for them to consolidate their absolute power. Perhaps the most well-known of the impacts of the Enlightenment is the Age of Revolutions it inspires. We're going to go over this much more in-depth in the next unit, but I want to make sure that you understand that the Enlightenment ideas don't just lead to a push for reform. In some cases, these reforms break into outright revolution. Remember that Locke's theory on the social contract essentially provides justification for revolution. This is exactly what is going to happen first in the American Revolution in 1776, then again in France in 1789, Haiti in 1791, and then in the early 19th century, we're going to see this spread to Mexico with the Mexican War of Independence and, of course, the independence movements in South America. All of the leaders of these political revolutions are inspired by Enlightenment ideas on what makes for a legitimate government. Guess what? It's not going to be an absolute monarch, and really any monarch that denies a large portion of its citizens a say in their government. Now, before I wrap up, I want you to take a second and think about how much we have to thank the Enlightenment for. And I'd really like to hear from you tomorrow with not only any questions you may have, but also with your opinion on which one of these impacts you think has had the most significant effect on your life today. Now, that's about all I have for you today. Hopefully this video lecture provided you with a good understanding of the impact of the Enlightenment. And if you only remember one thing from this unit, I hope it's the belief that ideas, once deemed absurd and downright sacrilegious, can actually change the world in really profound ways. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, Ms. Hart.